Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
So, Paul Goodman is unavailable, Charlotte Gill is unavailable, Henry Hill is unavailable, Ali G is unavailable, and so the great honour has fallen to me, Harry Phibbs, the local government editor of Conservative Home, to interview Jacob Rees-Mogg, Leader of the House of Commons, for this fortnight's Moggcast. Welcome, Jacob.
Well, welcome, Harry. I'm delighted that you're doing this. I always enjoy reading your information on local government, which you cover, I think, more thoroughly than anybody else within our broad media, and bring to our attention all sorts of funny dealings that are going on in local councils and interesting ways of doing things better as well, which I think is important. Well,
thank you. And I know you'll be keen to get on to the options for reorganisation of local government in Somerset with the different unitary status. But I thought, and I promise you we will get on to that, but I thought we'd start with the football. So we're recording this on a Monday, so this was last night. Did you have a chance to watch the game?
Yeah, I did indeed, yes, with most of the family. The younger ones gradually peeled off because they got rather tired, but there was a certain degree of excitement amongst particularly my sons.
And what was your reaction to the game?
Well, they did their best and they did stunningly well, but they didn't in the end win. And I think the country can be very proud of them. And I think that Mr. Southgate is a model figure, actually. I think his attitude, his mode of behaviour is inspiring and good for the country.
And there's some people who feel that it's got political implications as a sporting event, that if there's an upsurge in patriotic feeling, that might help the government of the day. It might have been a Labour government, of course, in the past, with Harold Wilson, who always used to supposedly get a political advantage from it. Whereas now some people feel that if there's an upsurge of patriotic feeling, that will help the Conservatives, because the Labour Party have perhaps got doubts on the extent of their patriotic credentials. I mean, other people think that the people are much too sensible to think it's got any political relevance to the economy or whatever. What happens in a football match? What's your feeling about the political significance, if any, of these events?
I think the political significance is insubstantial. I think the British people are far too sensible to decide who they vote or which party they support on the back of a European Cup final or any other major sporting event. I know Harold Wilson thought that the World Cup victory in 1966 gave him a great fillip, but I'm not sure that that's right. Economically, it may have an effect. I mean, there may be some effect on, particularly under these current circumstances, the normalisation of life. So people begin to feel like, well, we can go into the pub, and we've been to the pub and we've watched the match and we haven't caught COVID. And so I think it will encourage people to get back to normal, and therefore economically there may be an effect this time that there wouldn't normally be. But in the normal run of events, I don't think it has a great economic effect either.
I wanted to put you something. This was a tweet by Councillor Oliver Cooper, who's leader of the Conservative group on Camden Council, but it was a view that I think has been quite widely expressed. He says, penalties are the antithesis of football. No teamwork, no tactics, no stamina. They are not just the cruelest way to determine a match because of how much they focus on a single kick by a single player, but because they are everything football is not. What would be your comment on that?
I would be better qualified to talk about whether it is fair on left-arm bowlers that a ball that pitches outside the leg stump but would have gone on to hit the wicket should not count as an LBW, but the one that pitches outside the off stump and would go on to hit the wicket if it is in line at the point of striking would be a wicket. Because I know a little bit about cricket, but I'm afraid I'm simply not expert enough to discuss the finer points of football.
Well, perhaps in that case, then, I'd better not proceed with a lot of detailed questions about football and perhaps move on to other subjects.
I think that would be wise. But I think we should be very pleased with how well the team did, and that even people like me, non-footballers who know nothing about it, enjoyed watching a game of football last night. That can't be bad for football, it can't be bad for the country. But I don't think that turns me into an instant expert.
No. And so with we're looking forward to Freedom Day on July the 19th, when most of these remaining restrictions will be lifted. And we've seen an incredible effectiveness of the vaccinations, haven't we? I mean, beyond even what was expected, and we've still got more people being vaccinated, and the number of deaths is down to a tiny fraction of what it was a few months ago. So given all of that, why is it not possible for the government to give some reasonable guarantee, some reasonable sense of certainty that we won't have another lockdown? Do you feel able to give under, beyond reasonable doubt that we won't have another lockdown?
Well, it's the standard economist's phrase, isn't it? It's other things being equal. But in life, other things tend not to be equal. But assume that there is no extraordinary further variant. Assume that there isn't some extraordinary event that we can't foresee. Then you're absolutely right. The vaccine is working. It's working on all the variants. It has a very high success rate at preventing death, a very high success rate preventing hospitalization, a high success rate of preventing infection and transmission, as far as all the information so far indicates. So the 19th of July is Freedom Day, but nobody would have forecast in January of 2020 that the government would take powers to stop us visiting each other in our homes. I mean, it would have seemed the most unbelievable thing if anyone had suggested it. So I think politicians should learn from this and recognise that long-term forecasts are actually not necessarily very accurate. And
there's been some controversy about saying that because the government won't ban something or won't make something compulsory, that has scope for individual responsibility, that's a very confusing concept for people to cope with, and that they rely on being told what to do by the state, which seems a disappointing mentality. But that does obviously mean then that if we are given individual choice, that ministers, among other people, are going to be asked. I mean, so in your particular case, will you choose to continue wearing a mask, or are you looking forward to not wearing a mask?
Okay, I'm going to answer all your questions within that, because I think you start with making a very important point that the inner socialist is coming out of the Labour Party. And given the ability to do so, the socialist would tell us what time to get up in the morning, what to eat for breakfast, how to travel into work, what work we should do, what time we should have our lunch hour, what lunch we should eat, when we should go home, how many children we should have, as they do in China. This is what socialists believe in. They believe in collective control. The Conservative doesn't. The Conservative believes you can work out for yourself whether you should travel on a bicycle or in a car. You should decide for yourself whether to have Weetabix or, in my case, just a cup of black coffee, or whether you prefer to have a fry-up, a deep-fried Mars bar for your breakfast. Whatever it is, we believe in individual liberty, individual responsibility, and we recognise that people make better decisions for themselves than the government can make for them. And that's the key. The collective is, in fact, best served by thousands, millions of individual decisions made by intelligent people, as opposed to the man in Whitehall thinking he knows best, as a former Labour cabinet minister said. So then you come to my individual decision. This morning, I've wandered around the Palace of Westminster wearing a mask and met almost nobody. In those circumstances, I will not be wearing a mask. What would be the point? From whom am I protecting myself? Or whom am I protecting? So then you get to the question of, if you're in a very crowded space, would you decide that you wanted to wear a mask? Well, you may. But if you've had both vaccines, your risk of transmitting the disease is slight. So in a way, you've done your societal bit by having the vaccine as much as by wearing a mask, which is why I think it's sensibly individual choice. So would I rule it out completely? No. I may find there are circumstances where I feel it would be good manners to wear a mask. Am I going to wear one with any enthusiasm? No, I never have worn one with enthusiasm. But I see that there are circumstances where it may be advisable.
Thank you. I wanted to move on to talk about a Labour victory in a recent parliamentary by-election. And of course, I'm referring to the contest last week where Viscount Stansgate was returned for the hereditary peers by-election as one of the Labour peers. And of course, son of the famous Tony Benn. Do you feel that this idea of hereditary peers by-elections is a sort of Blairite initiative at modernisation and democratisation that is part of our constitutional legacy that should be defended, and some people might find quite an amusing aspect of our constitutional settlement, or do you think it's rather absurd and that really there should be an end of it?
Oh, I think it's absolutely splendid, and I congratulate the third Viscount Stansgate on his election to the upper house. It was part of a compromise that was done. The Labour Party decided to move towards an all-appointed House of Peers with a huge increase in the number. I mean, they then stacked the House, so it's got a strong left-wing majority in the House of Lords at the moment. But the quid pro quo was that as it wasn't a complete reform, it was just the removal of most of the hereditaries. 92 should be kept, 90 plus the 2 hereditary office holders, until there was a full reform. Now, it seems to me that you should hold people to their promise, that they should advocate what they want for the full reform. They shouldn't just take away the compromise without having any intelligent proposal for the full reform. However, there have been no sensible proposals for full reform since 1911, which, as you will recall, indeed, I have the text of it in this book, which listeners can hear. I'm picking up and could open if necessary. The preamble begins that the 1911 Parliament Act is a temporary measure until a more democratic method of having an upper house is determined. Words to that effect. Here we are 110 years on, and no better method has been found. So, as often with our constitution, we work with what we've got that has evolved.
And income tax is a temporary measure, and we haven't got rid of that yet.
It is indeed. Gladstone was the last Prime Minister to have plans for removing income tax, which he never then delivered. A typical Liberal, never delivers on his promises.
Yes. Perhaps we could move on to the topic of freedom of speech, which is also a lot of current reporting about the government's plans to try to protect freedom of speech in universities, and the Labour Party indicating opposition to that. I wonder if I could ask you something a bit broader in a way, is whether the whole thing is just, the universities are just too far gone, that in terms of people who used to feel great pride in getting into university, and parents, well, particularly if it was the first in a generation that made it into university, this was a great achievement and accomplishment. And now there's some doubt about, whether it's of any great benefit. And in terms of an opportunity for intellectual rigour, open discussion of ideas, the university often seems the last place to go. You're much better going to the pub or whatever. I mean, would you encourage people who are who are successful enough with their A-level grades that they would be eligible to go to university? Would you encourage them to do that?
Yes, I would. I think university is valuable, but university in today, so when people are listening to this, it ought to have gone through, is the second reading of the Freedom of Speech Higher Education Bill in the House of Commons. And I think it's important to protect these freedoms because you're right, university is about the discussion of ideas and engagement with ideas. It was very disgraceful that a group of dons at Oxford decided that they would not teach people at Oriel. It was an effort to enforce their will against a group of students who did not have responsibility for a decision relating to a discussion about roads rather than about any sort of detailed facts. And they decided that they would limit the option for intellectual engagement because it didn't meet with their approval. That's such an exclusion of discussion and debate and intellectual advancement that you would expect universities to have. That's the sort of thing that should be very strongly discouraged, not that you can legislate for people withdrawing their services, but you can certainly hold them up as examples of what should not be done.
And sometimes, of course, people would say there should be limits to free speech in terms of, well, for example, incitement to hatred. I mean, you've been on the receiving end of some disagreeable comments by a Scottish nationalist MP. I think he said he wanted you to go to hell, or I can't remember quite what the exact phrase was. But I mean, there's some people saying that really that's, he'd crossed the line and really he shouldn't be allowed to say that. What's your own thought on that?
I'm afraid I disagree with that. I've had a very nice apology from the SNP for it, which was most gracious that it was made. But I think this SNP MSP is entitled to discuss the likely prospects of my immortal soul. It's quite interesting that you're getting a discussion of hell in public life. I think theologically interesting concept, and I'm glad he takes such an orthodox Catholic view of the reality of hell. That is encouraging. But of course he's entitled to say that. That's perfectly fair. I'm a public figure. I've gone into this business. Nobody forced me to become a member of Parliament. I did it of my own volition. And people are free to say things about the prospects of my soul, are they not? I think that's completely reasonable. They're not allowed to incite violence. So when you deal with the problems on the social media, you get lots of really vile attacks on people, threatening women MPs, particularly with rape or with death threats. That's different. But saying so-and-so's views are so awful that he will be finding the fires of hell are hot is the sort of thing that Lady Anne Paisley used to do so exuberantly. And I think that's just the flotsam and jetsam of political life.
Yes. And you've been in, I suppose it's difficult for you now to find the time for everything, but in the past you've been to speak at universities, and occasionally there's been sort of demonstrations and rowdiness and whatever. I mean, do you feel that given the threat to the freedom of speech in universities, it's important for you and some of your high-profile colleagues to try and make the time to do more of these speeches at universities, even if, as Keith Joseph found in the 1970s, you sometimes face disruption.
Yes, I try to do as many as I possibly can. And I started doing this actually after the 2017 election, when it looked as if the Tories were just abandoning the field to the young, and Jeremy Corbyn was the one who was going to speak at universities and so on. So I thought, well, I think Conservatives must go and speak at universities. And as I say, I accept the invitations I can. Obviously, in the last 15 months, it's all been on Zoom. But the odd protest is, it's a free country. People are entitled to protest. What they're not allowed to do is hit you or hit the people who are turning up to the events. But to stand outside and say, down with X, is perfectly legitimate. But this is the insidious bit about freedom of speech. Because when I went to speak at Bristol University to the Conservatives there, they had security put on by the university, which the university thought was necessary. And then they got a bill for over £500 for the security. But that means they can't afford to have me back.
Yeah.
And that's the freedom of speech. The universities, in my mind, have a duty to make themselves areas where people can go and say things, particularly elected politicians, without making student societies pick up the tab. I think that's a tab for the university, not for the student group.
Now, we're here in Parliament. I feel a bit sorry for some of the 2019 intake, who obviously haven't had what they would have been, in many cases, working for a long time, of a normal experience of parliamentary life. And now, even though this is going to get back to normal after a while, there's this proposal for it to be decanted for 6 years for the refurbishments. And I saw a figure that it was going to cost £20 billion, which struck me. I mean, I think the normal punters would have 200 million would have thought it was a bit much, a bit excessive. But 100 times that, it would be, for many people, simply unbelievable.
Well, with the support of Mr. Speaker, we are fighting the good fight to get the costs under control, and I hope we're having some success. What is needed is to redo the wiring, to redo the plumbing, and to redo the central heating and other systems. What people started talking about was all sorts of extravagances, and having a completely new replica chamber for the time that we were out, which would then be used for school children and digging down 3 basements in Richmond House and all sorts of things, costing hundreds of millions into billions of pounds. It's trying to get this under control. And I'll give you a very interesting example. There was a proposal for Mr. Speaker to have a temporary residence, and that was going to cost £20 million. £20 million just for temporary residence for Mr. Speaker during the works, because he'd have to be out of the Speaker's house. This has in fact been done because the fire safety work and so on has gone on in Speaker's house recently, with a 95% saving against that proposal, because the Speaker said, I don't need a lift put in, I don't need this whole building demolished and then put back together with just the facade being kept. Let's just do a simple scheme, let's just repaint it and do it sensibly and affordably. So there are huge savings to be made, and working very closely with the Speaker, I hope that we can achieve these, and then the economic circumstances that exist, the sponsor body and the delivery authority will come forward with affordable programmes to do the basic works.
Perhaps this follows on to the more broader question about the public finances, and there seems to be a discussion between the optimists who seem to feel that with economic growth we'll be able to get public finances back into order, and others who are more pessimistic who will say, oh, we'll need to have tax increases. And it seems to me there was something being missed here, which was public spending, which even before the pandemic was £880 billion a year, about 40% of our money taken, and it didn't seem to be regarded as a possibility that there could be any savings in public spending. And often the discussion is, do we need to put up tax, or can we get away with sort of just leaving things as they are? I mean, did you find that? Am I being unfair in the way I'm characterising sort of government policy, or do you feel that there's a climate of opinion that just is the reality?
Well, I think that the pandemic obviously pushed off the spending review, and the Chancellor will hold a spending review in due course when things have settled down a bit more. But all governments always need to be looking for savings, because the nature of government is that it accretes things to itself, and you have to work out if those things are still things that are affordable. And so again and again, you need to run through sensible savings programs. And I'm sure that will happen in the spending review. There's no argument that government spending is at a perfect level.
Have you had a chance to watch GB News?
Oh yes, it's very good.
What are your thoughts on it? What have you seen?
I'm a great fan of Andrew Neil, who I think is a brilliant interviewer. The best prepared interviewer. It always seemed to me that he did his homework more thoroughly than anybody else, and therefore being interviewed by Andrew, you always have to be on your toes. And I think we do need a balance. I mean, it is funny. There's a row going on the BBC about appointing somebody from a left-wing organisation. And you have to say to yourself, when did the BBC last hire somebody from Conservative Home to come and be their senior figure? Can you recall that happening?
I can't.
No, or from the Daily Telegraph. But I remember when they appointed Andrew Marr as their political editor, who was a polemicist for one of the left-wing newspapers, somebody said to them, well, why hadn't they appointed Boris Johnson or somebody from the right? And of course they said, well, we couldn't possibly do that. He's far too controversial. But when it's the left, it's fine. When it's from the right, that's beyond the pale. And I think the BBC does itself a lot of damage in this regard, because people like Laura Kuenssberg make their political and professional reputations on being completely impartial. And she gets criticised by the left and the right in pretty much equal quantity. And then the BBC management goes off and starts suggesting it should hire somebody from a left-wing outlet. And that damages the whole perception of independence and impartiality in the BBC. And they really do damage themselves. They don't see this, because I think, well, the conclusion's obvious.
Well, that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.